Relax, Richard Harrington said with a careless laugh as he swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass. The real executive will be here soon. Assistants always arrive first. The private dining room of the Harrington Country Club glowed under warm chandelier light, the kind of golden calm that only existed in places where power had been inherited for generations. Outside the tall windows, manicured lawns stretched across nearly 200 acres of perfect green, bordered by white fences and oak trees older than the United States itself. Inside, a long mahogany table sat polished like a mirror, set with silverware that cost more than most people's monthly rent and plates waiting for a dinner meant to celebrate a $900 million expansion deal. The Harrington family filled the room with the easy confidence of people who believed the world had always been theirs. Richard Harrington, the patriarch, leaned back in his chair at the head of the table while his sons talked loudly about golf scores and private jets, and his daughter scrolled through her phone while sipping sparkling water that had traveled farther than most Americans ever would. None of them noticed when the door opened quietly. A woman stepped in wearing a simple black dress and low heels, nothing flashy, nothing designed to impress anyone who measured success by brand names. Her name was Jada Sterling. She walked with calm, steady steps across the thick carpet, the soft sound of her heels nearly swallowed by the room's quiet luxury. For a moment no one said anything. Then one of Richard's sons glanced up and frowned. "Oh," he said with a half-smile that didn't bother hiding its judgment. "They sent someone early." Another Harrington chuckled. "Probably here to set up the paperwork." Someone else added, "Or take notes." A ripple of laughter passed around the table, the kind that spreads easily when everyone in the room thinks the joke is harmless. Jada stopped at the empty chair halfway down the table and gently pulled it out. The room quieted slightly as she sat down, placing a slim leather folder in front of her. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Well," he said slowly, "you're a bit early for the staff briefing." No one asked her name. No one offered a handshake. To them, she was simply another employee sent ahead of the real decision-maker. Jada folded, her hands calmly on the table, her expression unreadable. She looked around the room once, quietly studying each face as if memorizing them. Across the table, one of the Harrington daughters leaned toward her brother and whispered something that made him grin. "You'd think," he said louder now, "that a $900 million negotiation would send someone with a little more seniority." Another voice chimed in. "Maybe they're running late. Traffic from the city can be brutal." Someone else laughed. "Or maybe the CEO didn't want to come all the way out here." Richard lifted his glass again, amused by the growing humor in the room. "Don't worry," he said casually. "We'll wait. The real meeting starts when the real executive walks through that door." Jada Sterling didn't react. She simply sat there in the quiet center of the room, calm as stone, while the Harrington family continued talking around her as if she were invisible. What none of them realized was that the real meeting had already begun the moment she walked in. The Harrington family continued their conversation as if the woman sitting among them were part of the furniture rather than part of the meeting. Crystal glasses clinked softly against the table while a server quietly refilled water and adjusted silverware with careful precision. Richard Harrington leaned back in his chair and glanced toward the closed door again, clearly expecting someone else to walk through it at any moment. $900 million, he said with a satisfied smile, tapping his fingers lightly against the polished wood. That is the kind of expansion that puts a company in a completely different league. His oldest son Daniel nodded and added, "Once Sterling Infrastructure signs, the financing structure becomes automatic. Banks line up for deals like this." Across the table, Jada Sterling listened without interrupting, her eyes steady and observant. The Harringtons spoke about the deal as though it were already guaranteed, as though the approval had already been stamped and delivered. Daniel continued talking, his tone confident and slightly amused. "It is honestly impressive how eager their board seemed. $900 million does not scare them at all." Another family member laughed quietly. "When you have investors behind you like that, risk becomes optional." Jada folded her hands calmly in front of her leather folder, her posture relaxed but attentive. The chandelier light reflected faintly in her eyes as she watched them discuss the future of their company, as though she were invisible. Richard took another sip from his glass and then gestured casually toward Jada without even looking directly at her. "So," he said, his voice carrying the relaxed authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in every room. While we wait for the actual executive to arrive, perhaps you can tell us how the paperwork will go tonight. I assume you are here to coordinate signatures. A few members of the family exchanged amused glances. One of the younger Harringtons leaned back in his chair and smiled with quiet amusement. Yes, he said. The assistant probably knows the timeline better than anyone. The laughter that followed was softer this time, but no less dismissive. Jada did not react. Instead, she calmly reached for the glass of water placed in front of her and took a small sip before setting it back down. The movement was slow and controlled, the kind of composure that came from years of experience in rooms where people assumed they understood power simply because they had inherited it. Richard glanced again toward the door and sighed lightly. It is unusual for someone negotiating a deal of this size to be late, he said. When you are asking for nearly $1 billion, punctuality becomes a matter of respect. Daniel nodded in agreement. Exactly. Deals at this level usually involve people who understand how serious the table is. His gaze drifted briefly toward Jada again before returning to his father. But I suppose assistants do not always control the schedule. Jada's expression remained neutral. She looked around the room once more, quietly observing the portraits on the walls and the carefully curated trophies displayed on the shelves. Every detail in the country club spoke of legacy and exclusivity. The Harrington name appeared everywhere, engraved on plaques, etched into glass awards, and printed in gold lettering on framed photographs of charity galas and golf tournaments. It was a room built to remind visitors who held power here. Richard adjusted his cufflinks and finally looked directly at Jada for the first time. Tell me, he said with polite curiosity that barely masked his condescension. How long have you been working with Sterling Infrastructure? His tone suggested the question was little more than a way to pass the time. Before she could respond, his daughter Caroline leaned forward with a small laugh. It must be exciting, she said, watching deals like this happen. Not many assistants get to sit in rooms where $900 million is being discussed. Another quiet ripple of amusement moved around the table. Jada Sterling remained completely calm, her eyes steady and thoughtful. Outside the tall windows, the evening sun dipped lower over the perfectly trimmed fairways of the country club, casting long shadows across the grass. Inside the room, the Harrington family continued speaking with effortless confidence about the future they believed was already secured. None of them noticed the quiet certainty in the woman sitting across from them. The certainty of someone who understood that the power in the room did not belong to the name carved into the walls, but to the person who had not yet said a single word. The conversation around the table continued to grow louder, the Harrington family comfortably filling the silence that Jada Sterling left untouched. A server quietly entered the room carrying a tray of appetizers and placed the plates along the long mahogany table with professional precision. The smell of grilled salmon and rosemary drifted gently through the air, while glasses of sparkling water and aged whiskey reflected the soft glow of the chandelier above. Richard Harrington leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table as he studied Jada with mild curiosity. You still have not answered my question, he said calmly. How long have you been working with Sterling Infrastructure? His voice carried the tone of someone who believed the answer would confirm what he had already assumed. Before Jada could respond, Daniel Harrington gave a quiet laugh. Father, she probably cannot say much about the deal itself, he said. Assistants usually stay out of the negotiation details. Caroline Harrington smiled politely, but there was a faint edge to her voice as she added, it must still be fascinating to watch. Not many people get to sit near decisions that move $900 million. Another chuckle spread around the table. The Harrington family had built a rhythm of comfortable dismissal, each remark reinforcing the quiet assumption that the woman sitting among them did not belong to the level of influence they represented. Jada remained still, her posture calm and balanced as though the conversation were simply another meeting she had attended hundreds of times before. She lifted her glass again and took a small sip of water, her eyes briefly moving toward the tall windows where the evening light continued to fade across the country club grounds. Inside the room, the Harrington family began discussing their expansion plans with growing enthusiasm. Daniel leaned forward and tapped the document lying near his plate. Once the Sterling Infrastructure funding is confirmed, he said confidently, We begin construction on the new logistics corridor immediately. 200 acres outside Dallas, full distribution network, rail access, and a private freight terminal. One of the younger Harrington cousins whistled softly. 200 acres is serious scale. Richard nodded with satisfaction. The land deal alone positions us ahead of every competitor in the region. He paused for a moment before adding with quiet pride. That is what happens when the right families work together. The phrase hung in the air with a subtle weight. Caroline glanced briefly toward Jada before returning her attention to her father. It is always easier when everyone at the table understands how these circles operate, she said. Daniel gave a small shrug and added, that is true. Deals of this size require a certain background, experience, connections. He looked at Jada again, this time with open curiosity. I imagine the Sterling executives have been preparing for this moment for years. Another family member leaned back in his chair and spoke casually. It takes a particular pedigree to manage capital at that level. The comment was delivered with an easy smile, but the implication was clear enough for anyone listening carefully. Jada Sterling did not interrupt. Her face remained composed, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. She allowed the silence after that statement to stretch just long enough for the room to feel slightly uncomfortable. Then Richard Harrington cleared his throat and lifted his glass again. Well, he said with a thin smile, we will not keep you waiting all evening. When your executive arrives, we will begin discussing the final numbers. Daniel nodded. Yes, the approval should be straightforward. Caroline added with quiet amusement, assuming the Sterling board understands what an opportunity this is. Jada looked slowly from one face to another around the long table, her gaze steady and observant. The Harrington family believed they were evaluating a deal. They believed they were negotiating from strength. What none of them realized was that every word spoken in that room was quietly revealing something far more valuable than financial terms. It was revealing exactly how they saw the people sitting across from them. And the woman they had mistaken for an assistant had already learned everything she needed to know. For a moment the room settled into a quieter rhythm as dinner was served and the Harrington family turned their attention to their plates, the conversation drifting between market forecasts and stories about past acquisitions that had made their name even larger across the country. Silver utensils moved across porcelain plates while the soft clink of glasses echoed lightly against the polished wood table. Jada Sterling sat calmly among them, the same quiet presence she had maintained since the moment she entered the room. Across from her, Daniel Harrington cut into his salmon and spoke confidently about the future. Once the corridor project is approved, we will dominate the entire freight line between Texas and the Midwest, he said. Distribution alone will generate hundreds of millions every year. One of the younger Harrington cousins nodded with enthusiasm. And with Sterling Infrastructure financing it, the risk is practically non-existent. Richard Harrington smiled with satisfaction. Exactly. Strategic partnerships are everything. As he spoke, he glanced once again toward the closed door, as if still expecting someone else to arrive and take the seat Jada already occupied. Caroline Harrington leaned back slightly and studied Jada with a curious expression that carried just a hint of amusement. You are very quiet, she said lightly. Most assistants would have at least introduced themselves by now. A few quiet chuckles followed the remark. Jada did not respond immediately. She simply placed her fork neatly beside her plate and folded her hands again on the table. Her calm silence created a small pause in the rhythm of the conversation. Daniel noticed it first. His eyes lingered on her a little longer this time, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. Actually, he said slowly, I am curious. Sterling Infrastructure is not exactly known for sending junior staff into negotiations this large. Richard gave a short laugh. Relax, Daniel. The real representative is probably stuck in traffic leaving the city. He gestured toward Jada with casual indifference. She is just here early to prepare the paperwork. Daniel nodded, but his eyes remained on Jada. Something about her composure did not match the role the Harrington family had assigned to her. Most assistants placed in a room like this would have looked slightly uncomfortable or eager to prove themselves useful. Jada Sterling looked neither nervous nor eager. She simply looked patient. Across the table, Daniel tapped his fingers lightly against the wood as if thinking through something. Still, he continued quietly. Someone trusted her to sit here tonight. Caroline laughed softly. Daniel, you are overthinking it. She gestured around the room with a relaxed motion. Look where we are. People come here because they know their place in the hierarchy. Her voice carried the casual confidence of someone who had never had that hierarchy questioned. Jada listened to every word without interrupting. The chandelier above cast soft reflections across the glass tableware, while the evening outside the windows darkened into the deep blue of early night. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair and studied her again. You have not told us your name yet, he said calmly. Richard waved a dismissive hand before she could answer. It does not matter, he said. What matters is that the sterling executive understands the opportunity waiting on this table. He lifted his glass again with quiet pride. $900 million is not something we offer just anyone. Another round of nods and murmurs moved through the Harrington family. To them, the deal represented the next chapter in a long line of successful expansions. To them, the outcome felt inevitable. Jada Sterling allowed the moment to pass without comment, her expression unchanged as she observed the people around her with careful attention. Daniel was still watching her. The more the others spoke, the more he seemed to notice what they were ignoring. Her posture remained composed, her gaze steady, her silence deliberate rather than uncertain. Finally, he spoke again, this time with a note of genuine curiosity. You do not seem surprised by any of this, he said quietly. Jada looked at him for the first time since the conversation began, her eyes calm and thoughtful. For a brief moment, the room grew slightly quieter, as if something subtle had shifted in the air. Daniel did not look away, and somewhere in the back of his mind a small, unsettling question began to form, the kind of question that appears when confidence begins to collide with uncertainty. If she was only an assistant, then why did she look like the most comfortable person in the entire room? The quiet tension that had begun forming around the table slowly thickened as dinner continued, and the Harrington family moved deeper into discussions about projections, market dominance, and the prestige they believed the partnership would bring. Richard Harrington wiped his mouth neatly with a linen napkin before leaning back in his chair, clearly pleased with the evening so far. Once the corridor is complete, he said confidently, our network stretches from Dallas all the way to Chicago without a single competitor capable of matching our speed. Daniel nodded while studying a tablet lying beside his plate. Freight volume alone will double within 3 years. Caroline added with an easy smile. And Sterling Infrastructure gets the prestige of backing the largest private logistics expansion in the country. A few approving murmurs followed her words. The Harrington family had already begun speaking about the deal as if the final agreement were a formality rather than a decision still waiting to be made. Jada Sterling sat quietly among them, listening as carefully as she had since the beginning of the evening. Her calm presence remained unchanged, but Daniel continued watching her with growing interest. Something about her composure did not match the role everyone else had casually assigned to her. Richard noticed Daniel's attention and shook his head lightly. You are still thinking about this, he said with a faint laugh. Trust me, son. When the Sterling executive arrives, you will see the difference immediately. Daniel did not respond. Instead, he glanced again toward Jada before returning his attention to the discussion. Across the table, Caroline spoke again, her tone friendly but layered with the same quiet superiority that had shaped the evening from the beginning. You know, she said thoughtfully, people often underestimate how complicated these negotiations are. It is not just about money. It is about understanding how certain circles operate. One of the Harrington cousins nodded in agreement. Exactly. Anyone can bring capital. But deals like this require a certain cultural understanding. The word lingered in the air just long enough for its meaning to settle. Jada Sterling remained still, her hands resting calmly on the table as she listened. Richard lifted his glass again and spoke with the relaxed authority of someone used to controlling every room he entered. In our experience, he said, partnerships succeed when everyone involved shares the same background of expectations. Daniel finally spoke again, though his voice carried a slightly different tone now. Background is not always the deciding factor, he said quietly. Richard gave a dismissive shrug. Perhaps not always, he replied, but it helps when people know how these environments work. Caroline looked toward Jada again with a polite smile. No offense, she said lightly, but negotiations at this level can be intimidating if you are not used to them. Another small laugh moved around the table. Jada did not respond. Her eyes moved briefly toward the tall window beside her, where the country club grounds had now disappeared into the deep darkness of night. For a moment, the reflections in the glass showed the entire table behind her. The Harrington family gathered under the chandelier, like figures in a carefully arranged portrait of generational confidence. The sight stirred a memory she had not thought about in years. She was 23 years old again, standing in a bank office in Atlanta with a loan officer reviewing her first major business proposal. The man had studied the documents carefully before leaning back in his chair with a polite smile that barely concealed his skepticism. "Your numbers are impressive," he had said slowly. "But projects at this scale usually come from people with more established backgrounds." She remembered the quiet pause that followed, the subtle suggestion hidden behind the word background. At the time, she had simply nodded, gathered her papers, and walked out of the office without raising her voice. That moment had not stopped her. It had only clarified the path she intended to build for herself. The memory faded as quickly as it had appeared. Jada Sterling returned her attention to the room where the Harrington family continued speaking about their expansion with effortless confidence. Daniel was still watching her carefully now, the earlier amusement gone from his expression. He had begun to notice something the others had not. Jada Sterling did not look like someone waiting for instructions. She looked like someone waiting for the right moment. The air inside the private dining room had shifted almost imperceptibly, the easy rhythm of the Harrington family's conversation now carrying a faint tension that had not been there earlier. Daniel Harrington was the first to feel it clearly. He could not explain why, but the longer the evening continued, the more the woman sitting quietly across from him seemed to change the atmosphere of the room without saying a single word. Richard Harrington continued speaking confidently about market expansion while tracing the rim of his glass with one finger. "By this time next year," he said with quiet satisfaction, "our distribution corridor will control nearly 30% of the freight traffic across the central region." Caroline nodded with approval. "And once the Sterling funding clears, the announcement alone will push our valuation through the roof." The others murmured in agreement, clearly pleased with the picture they were painting for themselves. Jada Sterling remained composed, her hands resting lightly on the leather folder in front of her. She had listened patiently to every projection, every confident assumption, every remark about pedigree and background that had been casually offered throughout the evening. None of it surprised her. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his curiosity finally overcoming the comfortable silence that had surrounded her presence all night. "You have heard quite a lot about our plans," he said calmly. "Most people sitting in your position would have said something by now that would normally pass unnoticed in a room full of conversation." But Daniel noticed again. He watched as she typed a short message and pressed send before placing the phone gently beside her folder. No one else seemed concerned. Richard continued speaking as if nothing had happened. "When the Sterling executive arrives," he said, "we will finalize the structure and move forward with the announcement." Jada folded her hands calmly once more. "That will not be necessary," she said. Daniel looked up immediately. Caroline blinked in mild confusion. Richard paused, clearly unsure whether he had heard correctly. "I beg your pardon?" he asked slowly. Jada met his gaze evenly. "There will not be another executive arriving tonight." The room fell quiet again, the earlier laughter fading into a silence that felt suddenly heavier than before. Richard leaned back in his chair with a puzzled smile. "That is interesting," he said. "Because this meeting was arranged with the understanding that Sterling Infrastructure would send its chief executive to negotiate the final terms. Finally focus their attention on her without distraction." Richard cleared his throat quietly and leaned forward. "I am not sure I understand what you mean," he said carefully. "If the chief executive is not arriving tonight, then why exactly are you here?" Son, but said nothing. Jada opened the leather folder in front of her and slid a document across the table. The paper stopped directly in front of Richard Harrington. "The proposed agreement," she said calmly. "Clarity is." Richard finally looked up from the document in front of him. His expression had changed. The relaxed host who had controlled the conversation earlier was gone, replaced by a man calculating how quickly the situation had shifted beyond his expectations. "Miss Sterling," he said carefully, "I believe we may have gotten off to an unfortunate start this evening." Jada did not react to the phrase. Instead, she opened the leather folder again and slid another sheet across the table. "This is the final investment authorization draft," she said evenly. $900 million allocated across 3 phases of development. Daniel leaned forward and studied the page briefly. The numbers were exactly as expected. The opportunity was exactly as large as the Harrington family had imagined. Richard glanced down at the document again before speaking. Document back across the table toward herself. Her voice remained calm and controlled as she spoke the next sentence, shifting from authority to persuasion.